Complexity is one of the defining characteristics of India and its multifarious identities. Its vast geography and tumultuous history shapes its social fabric in many ways, giving rise to diversity, nuance, and depth. It is also because of this that it is quite difficult to get a comprehensive yet detailed understanding of India that examines its societies, historical discourse, and modern imagination. In this episode, my co-host Amit and I, Srijana, talked to Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, Professor of History at the University of Chicago, about India and its several identities that embrace both its complexity and simplicity.
Very nice to meet you both.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much for accepting
Thank you
our
so much.
invitation.
No, that's all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I do get to meet Indians of your generation. There's students in Chicago, like people who've done their schooling in India, and instead of going to Ashoka, come to Chicago. And I meet some of them. So I get to know them a little bit. But it's always interesting to meet Indians of your generation. I've been out of the country now for the majority part of life. For more than 40 years, for almost 45 years. So I keep going back, but it's not the same.
Professor, you grew up in India and then went on to study in Australia and work in the US. So how did your childhood develop your idea of India and identity? What are the changes that those notions went through as you read and wrote more about history?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I was born a year and a half after independence. Right? And my family's, the roots of the family were in East Pakistan, what then became Bangladesh. And my mother's side was kind of semi-refugees. I mean, they came just before partition. But my father's side, they were already living in Calcutta, but going back to their own village for holidays and things. So, the Indian middle class is so varied from one region to another and they have their own very specific kind of histories. Like if you're talking to a Parsi, when I talk to my Parsi friend Homi Baba, for instance, growing up in Bombay, or Arjun Appadurai was a Tamil Brahmin but grew up in Bombay. It's very different experiences, or in Bangalore. So the Calcutta that I grew up in was very marked by both the independence and the partition. So, and some memories are very funny because, there was still a culture, even when I was kind of, let's say, I imagine I would have been 5 or 6 to understand the humor of it. So the police still wore the uniform they wore in the British period. So basically, they had a red headgear, the Calcutta police, and I think they wore khaki or something. These days they wear white. But the red gear I remember. So they look more like chaprasis, with red gear, tufts on top. And we used to go to the police and say something, expecting them to get very angry. So, Bande Mataram was a nationalist slogan. And then we used to rhyme that with a Bangla sentence, which says, we used to go and say, Bande Mataram, Pulisher Matagram, which means the idea was that on hearing Bande Mataram, the police would immediately become angry, because it's a nationalist slogan. So their heads would become hot. So the rhyme literally said, Bande Mataram, the heads of the police are hot. Right? They're angry. And of course, it was independence. After independence, the police were our own police. It was something we must have picked up from stories that older cousins or uncles said, that's how they would tease the British police. So we would tease the police thinking that the British police would be angry, but the police would laugh at us, thinking that these kids don't know that it's independent country. We're also independent. We're India's police force. We're not British police. So there are all these sort of so the independence was very much part of his hoisting the flag even at home, and this idea as a child that India was kind of something deep, something hallowed, something to be respectful of, something sacred or something like that. But at the same time, Calcutta saw very bad Hindu-Muslim riots in 1946. So there were many memories of riots, many memories of fear of the days of the riots, what families would do to protect themselves. So later on, when I moved to Australia, I realized that in the West, most people grew up my age, most people grew up with stories about the Second World War. They lost an uncle, somebody died, somebody's grave they would visit. Whereas the position that the Second World War had in the memories of my Australian friends and later Western friends, that place was taken by the partition. And I'm sure the same would have been true of Punjab, the two provinces of partition. So those were the two big memories. There was a strong memory of nationalism. Textbooks were already nationalist. One of the things, I was once giving a lecture in Berkeley on the 150th anniversary of Swami Vivekananda. And I was telling them that figures like faces of Vivekananda or Tagore, or these were etched into our memory because there were school texts with the one side was kind of a reproduction, not a photo, but a drawing of their face. And the other side was a page about these people. And as kids, we would often take a tracing paper and learn to draw these faces. So as I said, these are literally, I know the lines that you have to draw in order to get a Tagore on the page or get a Swami Vivekananda on the page, right? So I would say very strongly nationalist sentiments were very strong. And but the interesting thing was that the partition did not create anti-Muslim sentiments. Now, the partition was a sad fact. And there were some anti-Muslim sentiments maybe in my parents' generation, particularly in my mother's family, because they left everything and came. So they had resentment and some anger and stuff. My father, because their family was living in Calcutta for a long time, they didn't. And but the textbooks didn't preach against the Muslims. The idea that India was a secular country, that was very strong. Your parents talked about it. The idea that India was non-aligned, because these were the days of the Cold War. So parents would talk about Nehru and the principle of peace and Panchsheel and non-alignment, and so I would say nationalism was very strong. There was a spirit of nation building. If you see Bombay films from 1950s, even Raj Kapoor's films like 420, you'll find there's a nation building is a theme, how people come together, people from different places. Similarly, Bengali films, this was a theme, that we're building a nation. In children's stories and everywhere, there's this sense that a new nation is being built. And this was the time, towards the end of the 50s, the first IITs were set up. Then the second 5-year plan happened when I was 10 years old. But we used to hear about the heavy industries. By the time when I passed out of school, which was 65, engineering was just emerging as like IT today, was emerging as a kind of profession that paid well. And as we got into our puberty and sort of became young adults, kind of, or getting close to being young adults, we became aware that in the matrimonial columns in the newspaper, engineers became the most wanted kind of groom, right? So socially, you knew that a profession was rising in respect, because the respect was reflected in the choice of brides and bridegrooms. And But at the same time, for my generation, engineering was still not, at least for Bengali middle class people, not as respected as physics. So in my year, even in the few years after my graduation from school that I remember, 5 or 6 of the top 10 students would opt to do physics in Presidency College rather than go to an engineering school. We still thought engineering school is not about, stupidly we used to think that somehow building a bridge is less glamorous than knowing how to build a bridge or knowing why the bridge works. So it's kind of, so physics was seen as more fundamental than engineering. But that was a prejudice. I mean, I don't support the idea now. So, there were all those things, and plus, but there was a lingering sort of trace of the partition in where it came out was like some anti-Muslim sentiments on the soccer field. So, Calcutta was mad about soccer. It's only after globalization happened, television came, we began to watch soccer overseas, then we realized our soccer wasn't that good. Right? But we only saw soccer in Calcutta, and or at the most Indian soccer. In the Goanis, the clubs would come sometime, other clubs would come. But like into my teen years, there was a soccer club called Mohammedan Sporting, and there was a soccer club called East Bengal Club. So you can imagine all the refugees from East Bengal, the Hindu refugees supported East Bengal Club. And Mohammedan Sporting before independence was a club that was supported by the Muslim League and was identified more with the Pakistan demand. But again, it's like teasing the police. We used to assume that the Mohammedan Sporting after independence was also asking for Pakistan, even though they were not. I mean, eventually they would employ Hindu players, but in the first 12 or 18 years after independence, they were still using only Muslim players. So when there was a match between East Bengal Club and Mohammedan Sporting, it suddenly became about Hindus and Muslims and the partition. But otherwise, the biggest rivalry was between East Bengal Club and Mohun Bagan Club. And Mohun Bagan Club culturally represented people who were not from eastern part of Bengal, who were not refugees, right, whose families were on the western side anyway. And so that was a big clash culturally between the people who were seen as refugees in Calcutta, who were squatting on railway lands and things, and people who were originally of Calcutta. And these was made into a ritualized battle because people from East Bengal were meant to love hilsa fish, particular fish. People from Calcutta were meant to love shrimps or prawns. So the opposite thing happened when the East Bengal Club won. In many neighborhoods, you would find prawns hanging from poles as a taunt to the West Bengal people. And likewise, you'd find the reverse. There's a hilsa, but hilsa was more expensive than prawn those days. It probably still is. So my memories are all of kind of those sorts of things growing up. The big break in the memory was 1962 when the war happened, China. And that was a shock because the Chinese won the war so easily. And also because we used to think, because a few years before the war, the Chinese premier Zhou Enlai came to India. And there was slogans about Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. And we were all initially, in Calcutta, on the supporting the Indians. But there were books circulating and they were not proscribed. Books written by Westerners that were also blaming Indians for the war. And but in 1964, the result of the war with China, and everybody expected the Soviet Union to support the Chinese, but they didn't. But that's because basically there were all kinds of problems brewing between the Soviets and the Chinese. And in 1964, the Indian Communist Party split. And the present party that rules in West Bengal, in Kerala, West Bengal, CPI Marxist, CPIM, was formed as a result of a split in 1964. So 65, I graduated from school. And what happened was, the other big memories are 63, because of Indian emphasis in the second five-year plan on industrialization and heavy industries, they neglected agriculture. So there was a huge food crisis in the country, alongside the China war with China. And India then had to sign a pact with the US called under Public Law 48, where, because India is a poor country, but but it's a pact that has benefited me personally later on, because what the US did was a deal with India saying, we'll give you wheat. US had surplus wheat. But in exchange, you will give to the Library of Congress all Indian books published in Indian languages every year, in sufficient numbers for them to go to 9 libraries. And the University of Chicago was one of the recipients of these books. So if you came to my university, you'd find the library is a fantastic collection of books in Kannada, books in Sindhi, books in Hindi, and it enables us to teach. We teach about 11 Indian languages up to PhD level from undergraduate, right? So we teach Hindi, Bangla, Marathi, Telugu, Sanskrit, Tamil. Don't teach Malayalam, but we have in the past, but many other, including Farsi. So there are the main centers of South Asian studies in India, in the US, are all universities which benefited from India's food crisis. So some far-sighted academics must have told the US government, tell India that, okay, you can't pay in dollars, but give us your books, so that we can build up South Asian studies. So those were the years to which I grew up.
So it's very interesting to listen to your recollections like this, especially the entire book in the food crisis. That's really interesting, actually. And kind of progressing on to the next question, it's you've written a lot about historiography and the methods of studying Indian history, and I think we also know that history is not a very absolute discipline as it is. It also covers it's also biased, right? It has its own biases, that it covers victors more than the, say, people on the other side. But in India, especially with the caste hierarchy and the caste system, we often see that the history of these of the low caste individuals and communities are always pushed to the margins. How do you see these kinds of narratives that shape India and in Indian identity at large?
So, initially these narratives were quite blind to the caste question. So the fact is that Indian nationalism was a creation of the educated middle class in its official form. Same with Muslim nationalism. Jinnah was a highly educated person. And the masses, so-called, come into politics really after the First World War, when Gandhi comes onto the scene. And even though we say that, whether you call them Janta or whether you call them the masses, whatever they entered the scene, there's very little, in the context of studying nationalism, there was very little attempt to study castes. So caste, but on the other hand, when people studied social change, they studied caste. So M.N. Srinivas has a very interesting collection of essays. Ashok, I'm sure will have a copy. I think it's called Modern Social Change in Modern India. But it's a study of caste. So I don't know if you know this. Do you know when the British started doing national censuses in India?
It was sometime in the late 19th century, I believe.
Yeah. So 1871 was meant to be the year, but the census first volume was published in 1872. That's why we have every decennial, beginning of the decade, we do a census. That's how it started. The first census it's quite fascinating. British people were not used to answering government questions. So people were very scared of census takers, thinking that if you told the government anything about yourself, there'd be a tax on you. So first census was resisted. Census takers were beaten up. People thought this was an intrusive exercise by the government. But later on, when they realized that if your situation was recorded in the census and your group was named, then you could actually use those census facts to argue to the British government that you are a disadvantaged community or a backward community, you need more help from the government. So what we've now called Arakshan or reservation, its roots go back to the British period. And that made people peculiarly caste conscious of their caste. Two things happened, Sometimes many caste leaders were very upset that they thought they had been given too low a position in the census. So the British were flooded with applications saying, no, we are not that caste, or we are not so low. You have to recognize that we are higher up in the hierarchy. But then also you had other people writing, yes, we're that caste, but we need more scholarship, we need more services to help us uplift ourselves. So it was not like caste was not an issue, but on the other hand, when people wrote the history of nationalism, they forgot about caste. So the caste question became part of this. The masses came into politics, people were on the street. So the bigger categories like people, masses, so caste was not seen as a factor. It's only later that you realize that it came as a surprise after independence when India had universal adult franchise, that caste was a factor, that people actually sometimes voted for candidates of their own caste or religion. And the person after independence who wrote a lot about that was a man called Rajni Kothari, who set up the Center for Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, CSDS. So Srinivas did most of his writings after independence on caste. So, but the 20th century was the time when people were becoming aware of caste because of these rising aspirations, people's debate about how they should be seen socially. And now we know that caste was very much a contributing factor to nationalism in the way that people were mobilized. But in writing history, the other problem that arises is that, see, the lower down you are in a social hierarchy, the fewer resources you have to make permanent marks about you having been there. So if you live in a slum, if you look at the history of slums, you'll find that slums get gutted more often than pakka buildings. They catch fire. They're often made of inflammable material or inflammable material. So slum dwellers move around far more frequently than do people who live in pakka buildings. So it's easier to write if your thesis is about the history of fires in urban slums, you'll find a lot of document on that. But if you want to write about a particular family, then you wouldn't find documents. So there's always a methodological problem in writing about. One reason why history veers towards becoming about the victors is because the victors leave more documents. And it's based on documents. So not only So in recording the unevenness of society or social development, you will find that you encounter the problem of the unevenness of sources. Less literate people don't write, or non-literate people don't write. Literate people write. So there are a lot of structural biases in writing history. And even in the West, people began to think about writing the history of common people from the late 1930s. There was a socialist historian in Britain called G.D.H. Cole, who wrote a book in 1939 called The History of the Common People, English common, British common. And if you read that book and look at what his sources are statistics. So there are wage data. So there's no autobiography, there's no literary sources or poetry or anything. So you could see that even with the best of intentions, he was lumping individuals in numbers, right? That's how he was doing it. It's only from the 1950s towards the end that people began to try to write histories of working class people, marginalized people, and this trend grew through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So in a way, it's after independence that there was a kind of democratization of history itself. So the question of the low caste people, the untouchables, the ex-untouchables, the Dalits, etc., these became historians' problems after independence. And I would say from really the so if you look at 50s, we've broadly followed Western trends. 50s, 60s, historians in the West began to write about ordinary people, mainly working class people, Marxist historians. There's some books on working class history, but not by professional historians. 75 was the International Women's Year, and the second wave feminism started. Sometimes, even the impetus came from an organization like United Nations. They created a Women's Year. And all the nations that participate in United Nations took the message back, started their own kind of women's movement a year. In fact, the Indian report on the condition of women was written by Veena Das. Sorry, not Veena Das, Veena Majumdar, whose daughter Ranjini now teaches film studies at JNU, in arts and aesthetics. So Vinadi wrote the report on the condition of women. And again, that raised awareness, and people began to write feminist history, history of women's question, etc., etc. Subaltern studies that I was involved with started in the 80s. But even subaltern studies, we got criticized by Kancha Aila and people for not doing caste, because caste was part of peasants, right? Or people of India. Even for us, while anthropologists were studying castes, see the caste question, again, there's a funny relationship between actual politics and history writing. They're closely related, but usually with a phase lag. So what happens is the caste problem in India undergoes a very interesting transformation in the public sphere. So during, Ambedkar's time, Ambedkar used to think that there should be reservations as a temporary measure, so that people come up, and it's like a handicap in a race, right? So he thought this was not a permanent measure he was advocating. But then it's really in the 70s, Kanshiram in Haryana, starting the Bahujan Samaj Party, and Mayawati in UP was really his disciple. Kanshiram had the idea that caste should mobilize not only for economic gains like offices and no services, jobs and things, they should try to grab political power by participating in elections on the basis of their caste identity. But caste identity not just as individual caste like Malas versus Madigas, not that kind of debate, but whether you consolidated caste identity, Bahujan Samaj, right? Which means the majority, society of the majority. And that was actually a sharp departure from the Ambedkarite kind of thinking then, or Ambedkar's thinking. Today's Ambedkarites are not always thinking in the way that Ambedkar would have. I mean, they have respect for Ambedkar, but they would be a combination of Ashiram type thinking and Ambedkar's thinking. And the background to that also was that Indian leaders found out that the population was growing at such a rate by the 70s that all MPs were having larger and larger constituencies to represent, which means the connection between MPs and the people they represented was getting weaker because you were representing more people. So one way to solve the problem would have been to increase the number of MPs. But they decided for a while, instead of making parliament unwieldy, to give the panchayats more power. So they thought they'd solve the problem by devolving Indian democracy downwards. And these panchayats were one of the first institutions that caste mobilization targeted. Right? And it was obviously, and the problem always in India is that, you know, this goes back to the 19th century, but you see it in the 20th century and the 21st century. Suppose in your village you've known somebody is Dalit, and you always treated them like Dalit, you know, even if you've been kind and compassionate, you may have been patronizing. And one day you find that their young boy has gone to school or wants to go to school and doesn't want to do the work that you want them to do. So you think they're getting too big for their boots. So you think you'll teach them a lesson to tell them where they belong. And the upper caste were extremely resentful of the Dalits and these OBCs trying to, Bahujan Samaj, not OBC, below the OBC sometimes, trying to get power on the panchayat. And that political power, desire for political power was connected to desire for more education as well, because even when they got elected onto the panchayat, they discovered that a lot of the government information was in printed paper and they couldn't read them. And then they felt that upper caste people would interpret them wrong and take advantage of their illiteracy. And that produced that was a major fillip, producing increase in the demand for education. So overall, things that are happening in the political sphere influence people's thinking about caste and politics, representation. Same with women. And these things then flow back into history writing and becomes themes of history writing. So what happens, people think, okay, I'll write this history so that often in India we think we'll write a history that will help some particular movement on the ground, or a broad movement. So women's history, feminist histories are written in part to support the women's movement, provide them with a history that they'll feel good about. Similarly, Dalit histories are in part written to provide ammunition for the battles that they think they have to carry on. So, so there is this, so as I said, starting from the lack of sources, it really, as society becomes, for political reasons, aware of these problems, then problems come to the fore. And as they come to the fore, people then begin to take them up in academic ways, writing their histories.
It's very interesting to think about this diversity in the context of historical methodology, and keeping with this theme of diversity, the next question is about, like in your paper, in Nation and Imagination, you say that pluralism is important to imagine a country. So engagement in different fields is one of the ways to infuse plurality into the imagination. But only certain cultures make it to the national consciousness and the image of a country. Right now, the notion of diversity is found in the conception of a country, but there is a lot less engagement in to understand the multiplicity. How do you think this diversity of India can permeate into its imagination?
Okay, so let me hear from you a little bit.
So, according to me, there just need to be like more voices in the mainstream academia. So, like as you said, after 1960s, 1970s, there emerged like more scholars talking about caste, talking about feminism, and like giving them the tools to like tell their own story and like like their own like people's own personal experiences, people's own lived experiences influence how they view the world. And if we give the like if we give the if everyone has the opportunity to talk about their own worldview, then I think this could help in talking, like having multiple narratives about
Do you
us.
think that's difficult to do? I mean, I agree with
Yeah,
you, but do you think that's difficult to do? And what are the obstacles?
like there can be like conflicts of interest, as you said, like caste system is pretty prevalent, so not everyone would want a narrative that criticizes the upper caste to like come to the light, and like that's one of the things that I can think of right now.
And Srijana?
I think one way to do that, just adding on to Amit's point, is getting more listeners. I think in India we speak a lot. We want to speak a lot, but I think we lack listeners because we're so say behind or say hell-bent on making our voices heard. We forget to listen to the other voices that are being spoken. And I think because that causes the lack of diversity within its imagination, because then also we tend to restrict our imagination, restrict our sense of diversity also to just our voices and our community's voices instead of, say, listening to other things. And one other way of doing that is also via education. I think right now we've streamlined education to just fit into the sciences, the social sciences, the languages, and mathematics, and one elective. Instead of that, say, bring in a little bit of um, just say critical thinking about the social sciences, critical thinking about the sciences. I think when we do that, imagination just flows automatically, and we get to be more tolerant and more inclusive about the diversity that we inhabit.
Yeah, see, I think you're right, and it is, I don't know what you guys have to study these days, so it was interesting for me to hear how the subjects are, the spread of the subjects you do. That yes, the thing is, but what happens also, I think the question of listening is very important, because somebody might tell a story that hurts you, right? Whether from men to women, women to men, Brahmin to Dalit, Dalit to Brahmin, right? And sometimes we shut these stories up because we don't know how to deal with the hurt. So in South Africa and other places, there's been more than quite a few. I mean, countries have had what they call truth and reconciliation meetings, where you have groups that listen to each other's stories about being wounded by the other group, being hurt by the other group, and people tell these stories outside of the classroom, in the public sphere, somewhere. And our problem partly is that when that happens, we also risk violence, breaking of each other's heads, right? I mean, so in terms of, so the listening, the very act of listening is an act of toleration that you're talking about. So then the question becomes, a prior step become, how do you train somebody to be tolerant? How do you train somebody to actually listen to a story that might hurt you, that may be uncomfortable making for you? And that can work both ways. It's not just the upper classes that will score. Sometimes, there are unpleasant stories about other classes. But also, I think in India, what happens is that the government tries to calibrate the right amount of diversity, and that becomes a problem. Sometimes the government thinks that if there's too much talk about diversity, it might hurt the unity of the nation, its strength, the unitedness of the nation. And this has been a major debate in history in that sense. So people sometimes have said, yes, tell the story of diversity, but tell it in such a way that India remains united, that it's not undermining of Indian unity. But diversity itself has an aspect which, in any context, can be threatening to unity. If you by unity, that is a unity that you come before, that is there before you have learned to listen to each other. So if a society has not undergone that training, whether academically or by other institutions, of listening to each other's stories, then, Srijana, you've been plunged into darkness.
Yeah, there is one power cut here.
Oh, is that what's happening?
Yeah, there is a power cut
Okay.
here.
But your computer is working.
Yeah, my computer is working.
Okay. So my friend Partha Chatterjee has a very interesting expression he uses, and has a book that argues it clearly, what he calls a relativist view of India. It is to argue that India looks different from different positions, from different social positions, geographical regions, the India that Assamese people might see, even just as regional group, ignoring their internal divisions, might be a different India. But in our history, unfortunately, the national governments have always felt scared of that prospect. They have felt that kind of talk somehow undermines the unity of the nation. I personally feel we need to, in any situation, we need to hear that which is uncomfortable, even if you don't agree with it. So there has to be space for somebody saying that which is uncomfortable. There should be space for contesting it. But you see, to keep this kind of debate civilized, you have to agree on the rules of the debate implicitly. So you have to agree that, okay, we will go to the sources, we'll verify whatever. Sometimes what happens is that the contestation is not civil. You say something, somebody comes and vandalizes your office. So when that happens, then of course there's no toleration. So diversity requires tolerance as a condition for its flourishing. But tolerance is not a trait we're born with. Most of the time, particularly in diverse society like India, people don't, if you look at history, Indian history, most of the time people lived in their own groups and were not very curious about other groups. So there's a 16th century autobiography by a Jain merchant, Srimal community, called Ardha Kathanak, Half a Tale. It's based in Agra, and he's from the Srimal community. If you read his account, you'll find that the whole book is only about his community. The other communities in Agra don't make a strong mark in the book, right? I used to see growing up in Calcutta that there'd be a Telugu-speaking family next to us, a Bengali-speaking family. They would be polite. They would even exchange oil and salt when they were short on their provisions. But there was no deep curiosity about each other. There's a story that in Chicago, a friend tells, who had done PhD in linguistics on ancient Tamil language. And then after doing that, in linguistics, you don't have to really go to the place to do that. It's not anthropology. So she did her thing. Then she thought, after all, I've learned Tamil, I should go to Tamil Nadu and find out what the place is really like. So she lived in Madurai for six months, and she couldn't find anything that she read about in the way the Tamil women create buns with their hair, the flowers in their buns, the saris. In Sankam literature, she couldn't find any of that. She was in modern Tamil Nadu. They were wearing jeans and stuff. So finally, she asked her next door neighbor that, look, I have this problem that I don't see anything that I read about in Tamil literature that I read for my linguistics. So this neighbor says, oh, look, we are not from here. We don't know anything about this. He said, oh, you're not from here? He said, no. So where are you from? So he said, we are from another state, Karnataka. So he said, oh, I see. And how long has your family lived here? He said, for 300 years. So Indian diversity includes this tradition of getting on with people without knowing deeply about them. Right? And that's not a modern value. The modern value is to actually be curious, to find out more, to learn more about each other. And but when we say, and then particularly groups that have been in conflict, like the Brahmins and Dalits, whatever. So what happened was that when Indian nationalism developed, Indian nationalists just took pride in diversity. But they wanted a kind of diversity that would not threaten their sense of there being one nation. For them, it's a question of managing diversity. But a managed diversity is seldom the reality. Diversity by its own nature is wild. Say you create a group called the Bengalis. And within the Bengalis also we are Hindus, we are Muslims. Then within Muslims they'll say we are XYZ. Within Hindus they'll say we are XYZ. Within XYZ each group will say I'm so and so, and then you might even say, look, I'm not one person, I'm a plural person inside. So diversity can run riot with the theme of unity. And it's a intellectually very interesting question. And Partha thinks, and I don't disagree with him. I think it's worth going down that path of actually teaching Indian history in this relativist way. That to get people to understand that India looks different. On independence, for instance, the Nagas didn't want to be part of India. And the Nagas were not part of British India, they were a buffer zone. The British made them into a buffer zone. And they came to Gandhi and said, we are afraid that Nehru will force us to be part of India. Nehru and Patel. And Gandhi said, no, if they ever forced you to be part of India, I will be on your side and I'll take the first bullet. I mean, he took a different kind of first bullet, not the bullet that was meant to stop the Nagas from seceding. But the Nagas were taken in against their wishes. The Mizos joined willingly, but then fought in the state, right? And so in a peculiar way, I think there's a fear in India of too much diversity because we are so diverse, to this managing diversity. At the same time, there is a claim on every official forum, Indians will say, we are such a diverse nation. So there's both a kind of proud claim we make about diversity, but then there's a fear that too much diversity might threaten the unity. It's a fascinating question. It's a matter of how you negotiate that. But I think if you value diversity, then you have to be prepared for voices you don't like to hear. And that's where the question of toleration becomes very important. And the more confident we become about Indian unity, I think more we can become tolerant. And one of the amazing things about India is that if you go back to all the countries that became independent in the 50s, late 40s, 50s with India and later, India is one of the few countries that has remained intact. Pakistan broke up, right? So Sri Lanka almost broke up with the demand for Tamilism, right? So there's something in Indian diversity that works. And I feel we don't need to be fearful because there's the tradition. It's only when you put inordinate pressure that, like say a Bengali and a Tamil family live side by side without being deeply curious. But then you bring modern education in. With modern education, you can make people more deeply curious about each other, right? But before modern education, people got on and got by. And that's what my linguist friend was discovering. So in thinking about diversity, you also have to think historically about diverse forms of diversity, diverse practice of diversity. But remembering that sometimes people feel there's a tension between the demand for unity and the demand for diversity. So many people say it's where you draw the balance. But I think if a democracy is confident of itself, then it doesn't matter if some people are saying things that are not pleasant to hear from the side of somebody who values the unity theme more than diversity.
Yeah, Professor, that was actually a very fascinating response, and that really nicely ties up with the next question as well, which is about, say, the breadth of India itself. Because India is such a large country, people live in multiple centuries.
Absolutely.
As you said, like two neighbors might be living in totally different centuries. Urban spaces largely are thought of to be modern, right? When you look at metropolitan cities like Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore, they're largely thought of as modern, and rural areas are more traditional, but they all exist within the same country. So what does it really mean to be modern, or what is modernity? And I think a more particular question in that: who is a modern Indian? Would you just call a city dweller a modern Indian?
So that's a great question, question you can't really fully do justice to, sort of in this kind of conversation. But I should also tell you that my book Provincializing Europe and my book Habitations of Modernity are books that address those questions. But without going there, yeah. So basically, I think if you define being modern in such a way that somebody looks less modern or backward, then that becomes a problem itself. So the question is, how do I define modernity in a more inclusive way so that modernity itself looks diverse? And you said no particular template of modernity is the model or that everybody must follow, right? But that doesn't mean that there are differences. The differences sometimes enable you, differences sometimes disable you. So think of a auto rickshaw driver in Delhi alongside your professor in Ashoka. So in a way, they are both living in the same time. They are, from one point of view, you might say that they live in different centuries because the cultural baggage might be different. But there are certain kind of cultural skills that your professor has that might enable them to negotiate the legal system, negotiate the official system when they encounter it. And the scooter driver's education culture may not have given usually him those sorts of skills to the same degree, and to that degree they get disadvantaged by their kind of modernity. Right? So I think better than modernity, if you work with the idea of being contemporary, belonging to the same time, modern or not, and being contemporary in different ways, and then calibrate those differences along the axis of inequality and unequal access to the goods and services that any citizen is entitled to. Then you can talk about what they need without making them look backward, or because then the lack would be very specific, that in order to get these services, they need this. And sometimes, and the path to getting the services may not be the same as an educated person's path. Sometimes politically they get together and they can make demands. So take the farmers. agitation was a very interesting case in point. And it actually is about modernity. You'll find that people who are opposed to the farmers' movement, from the government side, they were saying Indian agriculture needs to be modernized. Why? There are good arguments, because a lot of agricultural products are wasted. We don't have enough of industries that process agricultural food, canned food to juice, whatever, which you can export. So there's a lot of lost opportunities in agricultural food. So there's an argument for modernization. But suppose your vision of modernization is one that requires that model that I was talking about, requires you to build cold storages, right? So that food doesn't get wasted. Not only Food Corporation of India godowns, but cold storages and other facilities. So it requires an injection of capital. And that injection of capital can only be provided by very wealthy people. But Indian agriculture is on the whole based on smallholders, peasant families with relatively small holdings. So that model of modernization would eventually threaten the smallholder. They would feel that we'll go extinct if that modernization comes. But on the other hand, it's not like the farmers, if you ask them, they would say, I don't want opportunities for my children. I don't want to increase my income, right? So this question is of not that the farmers being backward and that model being modern. The farmers would say, let's look for another form of modernization, which uses the small holding property creatively. The fact that we're all small-based agriculture, and does not overnight try to change this into an American-type capitalist farming where agriculture is connected to firms like Kellogg's, right? And the farmers won because they're so numerous. Because it's small holding, therefore it's numerous. If there were already 5 people holding the entire land of Haryana, they wouldn't have won the struggle. Right? It's the numbers eventually that you have. They cast votes. If you upset them, you lose the vote, whatever. The one that struggled. But if you think of that story in terms of modernization, one might say that this was a battle for 2 different visions of modernization, 2 different ways of being contemporary and addressing problems of contemporary. So I often find the word contemporary is a better word than modern. Modern is too loaded. It makes somebody look advanced, somebody backward. It inevitably raises questions of models. Like this is where one should be. This is what one should be like. So if you say America is more advanced and modern than India, then you're making the proposition India should look like America and act like America. And some people do say that, right? On the other hand, if you subscribe to that, then you will have to feel that I have to drag, my country screaming and kicking to becoming modern, right? But you could be more with the people and think about creatively working with them, see what opportunities provides. And you may not have a huge big template like America. You have to be like that. So again, these are interesting debates in society. But as somebody who has thought about modernity, I find modernity has this problem that Srijana, you were articulating in the question, both of you. And I think the task is to think in what sense is somebody who looks backward or who looks like they're in a different century is actually my contemporary. But I would say if you get an opportunity to read those 2 books of mine, you'll find that I actually discussed this question.
It's very interesting to think about this modernity in the way you described, like this ideal standard that we should achieve. And like keeping with this, the next question is about how, like, you were one of the pioneers who problematized the Anthropocene and destabilized it from its scientific context to ask questions like, who does the Anthropocene really belong to? So, what are the effects of capitalism on the Anthropocene, considering that India is a developing nation and was colonized for more than 200 years? how do you place India within this Anthropocene, and how do you see Indians navigate through the Anthropocene?
I will, but tell me a little bit about what both of you understand by Anthropocene.
So
That'll give
what
me
I
some
understand,
sense of where you are at, so that I can address your question better.
yeah. So what I understand from the Anthropocene is like when human activity started to have a large impact on the geology of the earth and like started to change it, and like that's
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 good.
where I'm at.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And Srijana?
Yeah, similar to what Amit said, actually, Anthropocene, I also believe, is the current geological era, epoch that we're presumed to be in. It's sort of a departure from Holocene, and anthro literally means humans. So we are the drivers of
Anthropos.
this entire geological epoch.
True. So I think you're both right. That it's, I mean, scene means time and age, or it's technically epoch, because epoch is the smallest geological unit in how they measure time, geological time. But it is also about impact that both of you mentioned. So just some facts you should know. So a lot of this global warming is because of fossil fuel usage, as you know, right? Now, did you know that 87% of the fossil fuel that humans have used have been used since after 1950? Right? So what do you think of human population? Do you have any sense of how the human population has grown?
Yeah, the human population kind of grew exponentially after industrial revolution, and uh, especially say after the 1950s, I think it grew even more in particular countries, and say India and China had the big boom after the 1970s. And
So in my lifetime, Indian population has grown 4 times, more than 4 times. When I was born, India has about 330 million people. And we had exactly the same number of gods. And so suddenly gods is the same situation now as our MPs, they had to look after every per god, you had more people to look after, but they don't have the panchayat solution. But maybe they do, sort of delegate to modern lesser gods like Santoshima and yeah, so in 2000 there's the statistics showing in 2000 people who were consumer, like who bought fridges and cars and things. In 2000 globally, the Western countries provided 70% of these consumers, around 2000. Today, 70% come from China, India, Africa, Latin America, the growing new middle classes, people like you and me and others. So we've become the major consumers. 90% of the world's fish supply today comes from Asia. Bulk of that from China. And the other interesting thing about the number of people who are consumers are now between 4 and 5 billion. So if you extend, even if it's a 5 billion of consumers, then 3 billion human beings still live very bad. Right? And if you look at, so the first time we reached number 1 billion consumers was 86. 1986 was when there were 1 billion middle class people in the world. Now, as I said, it's over 4 billion perhaps. And every later billion, every second billion has been added much quicker than the preceding billion. So there's also an acceleration at which we're consuming. So I say, if you look at global warming, then if you want to think about who is guilty, who is responsible, then the Western countries and Japan are retrospectively guilty, because those are the countries that produced. And per capita, they're still there. Per capita, there's no question. But Even Australia produces a lot more per capita than India. But purely in terms of global emissions today, looking prospectively, clearly China and India have a large population. They want to pull out of poverty, and therefore they're using fossil fuel, mostly coal. Coal is still very important. So that produces a problem. So on this question of responsibility, people take different positions. So Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal, when they first, from the Center for Science and Environment in Delhi, when they first raised this question, which was 1991, they said the distinction was between industrialized countries, including imperial countries and once imperial countries, and non-industrialized, decolonized countries. But then there are other theorists who blame it on capitalism, assuming that capitalism is mostly Western. The interesting problem is that you can blame other people. There are a lot of grounds for blaming other people, but that won't solve the problem. Because India, for instance, talk about India. India is very exposed to climate problems, partly because we have this large coastline. So sea level rise, acidification of the oceans, going to affect us, and we have the glaciers on top. And Indian urbanization is such that we've already made most Indian rivers into sewers. That's just this morning I was talking to Australian friends who were diplomats in Chennai. And they were telling me that they couldn't turn the air conditioner on in driving in Chennai in the cars because the rivers were so stinky. He said rivers are like big drains. So even forgetting climate change, we have our development is basically killing the rivers. And without realizing how much we depend on that river. And Sundarlal Bahuguna, who led the Chipko movement, he used to say about the Himalayas, he used to say, the main produce of the Himalayas is not apples, it's water. And the Himalayas out of the glaciers come 8 or 9 rivers. Not all rivers are glacier fed, but most of them are. And these rivers service 8 to 9 countries from Pakistan to Vietnam, India, China, Bangladesh, 8 to 9 countries. There's no agreement between these countries about how to maintain the health of the glaciers. Instead, Himalayas are so dominated by geopolitical factors that it has become the most militarized mountain range in the world today. And now we know that the Himalayas are a young mountain. Young mountain means it's still growing. It's an active mountain, it's still growing. Because the plate, the Eurasian plates, and the African plates, the collision that actually created Himalaya, that's still going on. So which means its kind of internal state is not as stable as a mountain that has ceased growing. So, but to build roads, airfields, you have to blast this mountain. So when you blast these mountains, you can create a situation of landslide. The question is, there is a politics of blaming and things to be gained from that. I think Western countries that are historically responsible and are more technically developed should give free technology and stuff to Indians, or to other countries that need. Because it's everybody's problem. So the question also is, what do we do on our own? I'll give you an example from West Bengal. So in West Bengal, where the Ganges gets into the sea, a lot of again fisher communities, fishing folks in the West. And the women folks, they spend all day standing waist deep in the river water, collecting little fish in cane baskets. And unbeknown to them, now they know the water has become salty. You see what has moved in. The fish has also changed, perhaps. Salt water causes all kind of fungal and other infections in women's reproductive organs. And a bunch of rogue doctors moved in, exploiting these poor women by performing hysterectomy on them. So the infected uterus was taken out. And the problem is, if you have had hysterectomy, then you can't lift weight. So when a middle-class woman undergoes hysterectomy, it doesn't matter because we have servants. It doesn't matter so much. But a poor woman has to do that manual work, and it makes her life more difficult. So now some friends of mine are trying to lobby the West Bengal government to regulate hysterectomy. See, normally I would have never connected hysterectomy with climate change. But it's really these kind of disasters. And these, I was giving a lecture in Kerala at Kottayam at the Mahatma Gandhi University on global warming, and then the professor of physics, a woman, actually stood up and told me that coastal water has become salty. And women in poor families have to travel further to get fresh water with which to cook. You can't cook with salty water. In India, there are 3 countries in which there's a boom in construction: US, China, and India. The boom in construction means that in India, the last 15 years, the demand for sand has increased 3 times. Now, all the state governments and central government has restrictions on sand mining. Because if you take too much sand away from rivers, by the way, in construction, you can't use desert sand. You have to use sand from riverbeds. So if you take too much sand away, it changes the course of the river, it changes the relationship between the river and how much water the land uptakes from the river, all of that sort of stuff. The ecology is destroyed. But the demand for construction is so much that we can only meet that demand by mining sand illegally. So whether you look at Maharashtra, you look at Chennai, you look at Tamil Nadu, you look at West Bengal, illegal sand mining is rife. And our political system supports it. Not the system, but the politicians support it. Because sometimes politicians themselves involved. I mean, you know, in your own state, Karnataka, for instance. I mean, when the Beijing Olympics was on, there was a number of illegal iron mines, you know, and the 2 brothers who were famous for illegal mining. So so our political system, our politics hasn't yet responded to the crisis. You know, in 2018, there was a report by a Central Supreme Court appointed committee, which found that in the Aravalli range of mountains in Rajasthan alone, they said 31 mountains have gone missing. So how do mountains go missing? Which means they've been illegally razed to the ground to use them as quarries for marbles that will go into the kitchens of middle class people. Because now everybody wants a kitchen bench that is, you know, granite or some other marble. The kitchen is aesthetically beautiful, but we don't connect our everyday aesthetics with what's happening. You know, there's not a rule that tells you that when you buy a piece of marble, there should be a history of that piece. There should be a government agency saying, okay, illegally quarried marble cannot be sold legally. Right? I mean, you need some, but these reforms haven't happened. Partly because people who are doing illegal quarries are either connected to politicians or they're politicians themselves. Yeah. And that connection, coming back to it, so I'm moving away from who to blame historically. We can debate that till the cows come home. The problem is our problem too. You know, and while you might get some moral satisfaction dumping it on the West, and it's fine. I mean, I don't disagree with that. The question ultimately becomes: it's our future. What are we doing over our future? And it's our poor people who are going to suffer most. So I actually feel there should be more money going into what they call climate adaptation measures. So stopping climate change is called climate mitigation, mitigating the effects of climate change. But now we are beyond that point. We'll have to live with climate change. So we have to put money into measures that help people survive and survive well. So some disasters management has improved in even my own state of West Bengal. I mean, like when the tsunami happened, Jayalalitha's government did a very good job. So for some of these things we have put in places, like you get advanced warning system, so that you know a tsunami is coming, you move people out. So if you look at, again, the number of people who die from tsunami or cyclones, you'll find that that's going down because we've got systems in place, so we move them out to save. But we don't save their property. We don't save their crops. Does it make sense?
Yes, Professor, definitely. But if you could just elaborate on what can India, with the current resources that it does have and the kind of wealth that we do have right now, how can we navigate through these bigger issues of climate change and climate adaptation, as you were mentioning? What are some of the steps that
I
we
think
can?
people have to, I mean, there are friends in India who are better placed to speak about this because I don't work on practical problems. I mean, Navroz Zubash, my friend in Delhi at the Center for Politics Research, he works on these questions. The real problem is the block in India is really where corruption, interest of nexuses between politicians, criminal mafias, and bureaucrats, or police force. Our laws are good, but the problem is implementation partly. Now the problem is, of course, how the philosophical outlook. So there's an article that I read on most of the judgments by the Green Tribunal in India. And this article was saying that while all the judges say we should make things more sustainable, they end up saying they eventually let all projects claiming to contribute to India's growth, they let them go forward because the judges themselves think that growth is a more important consideration than ecology. And I've heard many Indian friends say, like the West, we first need to get rich before we can deal with this problem. The problem is that there may not be enough time in which to repeat the Western experience. See, again, it's a complicated question. The way that China took advantage of deindustrialization of America, England, etc., and became industrialized by supplying these markets. For whatever reason, we missed that bus. Then when IT revolution came, so-called, we thought, okay, this would be our really the growth engine. And then we found out that IT increased our GDP, but didn't lead to huge amount of increase in employment. So the bulk of our labor force is still in the informal sector. And so it's really the model is very different. And I think for many Indians, the urgent question, middle class and upper class Indians, the urgent question is to get a seat in the Security Council. The big power ambitions that people should take us seriously, respect us, etc., America and other countries. That's the ambition. And there, poor people, unfortunately, don't count for very much until the elections come. That's my sense, even with these stories I told you. So there are things to do at different levels. I mean, India should argue at the global level and get the West to, as this, they pay for damages, transfer of technology and all of those things. That's fine. There's no problem with that. But you also need a political system that is attuned to the destruction of the environment that we are doing. The West is not doing it. Why should 31 hills go missing? And that's only reported number of hills. You just go to any place. I mean, I really don't have to tell you. I was driving from Kolkata to Kalyani, which is like a city, sort of away from, there's universities and other institutions there, kind of 2 hours drive. All along the freeway, they were burning plastic waste on both sides. Now, that's bad. I mean, burning plastic waste in that sort of can't be good for the air, but people were doing it. So in some ways, we lack in our cultural training, our training in politics. We don't yet think of ecology as important. And in that sense, I think we are extremely short-term in our view. The West didn't think of ecology as important, and that's brought us climate change. Now, we are a populous country, a growing country, strong middle-class China, and if these countries don't think about ecology, then I think the future is going to be disastrous. But if you look at Indian middle class, you'll find that basically a bulk of the middle class think that their children will live somewhere else. That somehow people still think that rich countries will look after themselves. And if we get a passport or visa into rich countries, then we're all right. So these are both political questions. I mean, like in Kerala, the professor was telling me that this problem of the poor women is something that is so below the political radar. So practically, if you ask me what can we do, one has to make sure that the issue becomes political, just as we expect certain things from the government, that we expect the government to act on these problems. And I think the practical thing would be to work with communities that actually are suffering the brunt of it at the moment. Intellectually, again, we've been so focused on growth and Hindu-Muslim question and secularism versus non-secularism, BJP versus Congress, kind of that sort of stories. You know that when I first wrote my essay on climate change, I wrote it in Bangla for a Calcutta magazine. And none of my friends were interested. Then somehow, for whatever reason, I wrote it up in English and published it in America. And then immediately it got translated into 12, 14 languages. It produced a debate about whether it's capitalism or this or that. And I often think back and ask myself, why were my friends not interested? And that's partly like the caste question. Ecology has taken such a low place in our thinking compared to the importance of growth and equality and inequality. But these questions are connected. When a disaster comes, the people who are unequal, people who are lower down will suffer more. So, yeah.
Yeah, Professor, I think that was all the questions that we had.
Okay.
It was a really nice conversation. It was very enriching.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Stay well. Take care, and I wish you all the best with everything.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for accepting
Thank you,
the
Professor.
invite and talking to us.
We are very grateful to Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty for accepting our invitation and taking the time out to talk to us. If you like this episode, then subscribe to Quintessential Conversations and stay tuned for more episodes.